She's still just a gutter girl. She's probably here to shoplift what she can't afford. You have no idea who I am now. Nyla didn't fight back when he first grabbed her arm in the middle of the store. She only froze when her ex-boyfriend leaned in and whispered the one insult that proved he still thought he owned her soul. She knew the world was about to change the moment the store manager stopped calling security, and instead bowed to the man entering the room like he was a god. It wasn't until the store's glass doors were locked from the inside, trapping her with her past and her future, that the truth cracked open. Her new protector wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a gentleman. And when Kim Taehyuk stepped toward them, not with a smile, but with a gaze that promised a slow death, her ex finally understood. Nyla hadn't just moved on. She had been claimed by a man who burns down empires for fun. Welcome to the Afro-Korean story space, besties. A huge shout out to Nyla for the inspiration behind today's incredible lead character. If you're tuned in right now, drop a yes in the comments if you love seeing a toxic ex get exactly what he deserves. To my loyal subscribers, a warning. This story has a twist in Chapter 7 that will leave you speechless. If you leave now, you'll spend all night wondering how Nyla's king handled that final confrontation. Drop a comment right now if you are ready to see the moment the mafia boss puts this man in his place. The sky over the city was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of rain that Nyla Washington could already feel in her bones. She stood on the curb, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped the handles of 2 bulging trash bags, the sum total of her life after 3 years of giving everything to a man who now looked at her like she was a stain on his designer rug. You really thought this was forever, didn't you? Marcus sneered, leaning against the doorframe of the apartment she had helped him pay for while working double shifts. He looked down his nose at her. His expression twisted with a cruel sort of amusement. Look at you, Nyla. You're a gutter girl with natural hair and big dreams that will never pay the rent. You have nothing to offer a man like me. I gave you everything, she whispered, her voice cracking as the first drop of rain hit her forehead. I supported you when you had nothing. Marcus laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut deeper than the wind. And that was your first mistake. You were a stepping stone, nothing more. I'm moving up, and people like you are meant to stay exactly where I found you. At the bottom. He stepped back and slammed the door, the click of the deadbolt echoing like a gunshot in the empty hallway. Nyla stood in the downpour, her cheap clothes soaking through as she watched her reflection in a nearby puddle. She looked small, shattered, and utterly disposable. Her family was thousands of miles away, her bank account was empty because of his investments, and she was standing in the dark with nowhere to go. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the bags in her hands. She remembered the way he had mocked her curls, calling them unprofessional, and how he'd told her she'd be lucky if a janitor ever looked at her twice. In that moment, the ghost of poverty wasn't just about the lack of money. It was the way Marcus had stripped her of her dignity, leaving her to believe she was truly worthless. As she started to walk, her heels clicking rhythmically against the wet pavement, a spark of something hotter than sadness began to flicker in her chest. She looked back at the darkened window one last time, her brown eyes hardening. Marcus thought he had finished her, but he had only cleared the way for a version of Nyla Washington he wasn't capable of imagining, a woman who would eventually make his entire world tremble. 3 years later, the humid rain of the past was a distant memory, replaced by the climate-controlled scent of expensive leather and French perfume. Nyla moved through the exclusive boutique with the grace of a woman who didn't need to check price tags. Her natural curls now a crown of confidence. She was searching for a gown for the Sapphire Gala, something that whispered power rather than screamed for attention. Her fingers trailed over a rack of silk when a voice, oily and familiar, curdled the air behind her. I didn't know this place had a policy for charity cases. Nyla's heart didn't stutter. It steeled. She turned slowly to find Marcus standing there, looking exactly the same, yet somehow smaller than she remembered. He was dressed in a suit that tried too hard. His arm draped around a woman who looked as bored as she was expensive. He stared at Nyla, his eyes scanning her fitted black dress and the way she carried herself with an authority that didn't fit his memory of the girl he'd left in the rain. Marcus, she said, her voice a cool blade of silk. I'm surprised you can afford to breathe the air in here. His face flushed a dull red. his ego clearly bruised by her lack of flinching. Still got that smart mouth, I see. What's the matter? Did you find a way to sneak in through the back? Or are you just here to play dress-up before security realizes you don't belong? He stepped closer, his mocking grin widening as he looked at the gown in her hand. That dress costs more than your father's house, Nyla. Put it back before you snag the fabric with those rough hands. The woman beside him let out a sharp, condescending giggle, but Nyla just smiled. It wasn't the smile of a victim. It was the smile of a predator watching a moth fly into a flame. She saw the way Marcus looked at her, the desperate need to see her crumble, to see her become that gutter girl once again. He was still the same man who measured worth by a bank statement, never realizing that the woman standing before him was now protected by a shadow much longer and darker than his own. You haven't changed a bit, Marcus, Nyla remarked, her eyes fixed on his. Still trying to build yourself up by tearing others down. It's a shame. You're standing in a room full of luxury, and you're still the cheapest thing in it. Marcus's eyes darkened, his hand twitching as if he wanted to reach out and shake the composure right off her. He didn't see the black SUVs pulling up to the curb outside, nor did he notice the store manager suddenly going pale as he looked toward the entrance. He was too busy living in a past where Nyla was nothing, completely unaware that his time was running out. Marcus let out a sharp, derisive snort that drew the attention of the other high-end shoppers. "Manager!" he barked, his voice booming through the hushed, elegant space of the boutique. "How long have you been letting people from the slums linger here? This woman is a fraud. She doesn't have a penny to her name, and she's probably looking for something small enough to slip into her bag." The store manager scurried over, his brow furrowed as he looked between Marcus's expensive suit and Nyla's calm, regal posture. "Is there a problem, sir?" "The problem is her," Marcus pointed a trembling finger at Nyla, his face contorted with a desperate need to see her humiliated. "I know her. She's a nobody from the streets who thinks wearing a nice dress makes her part of our world. She's a thief or worse. Throw her out before she ruins the atmosphere for the actual paying customers." Nyla stood her ground, her fingers tightening slightly on the silk of the gown, but her expression remained an unbothered mask of stone. She could see the manager hesitating, his eyes scanning Nyla's striking presence and the way she held the gown as if she already owned it. But Marcus wasn't done. He turned to the crowd of onlookers, his voice dripping with venom. "She used to beg me for rent money, and now she's here acting like she can afford a 5-figure gown. It's a joke. Go on, Nyla, tell them. Tell them you're still that same girl I tossed out like trash." "I am that girl," Nyla said, her voice low and steady, carrying a weight that silenced the room. "But I'm also the woman who learned that a man's worth isn't measured by his shouting, Marcus. You're making a scene because you're terrified that I've outgrown the cage you built for me." "Enough," Marcus snapped, his ego finally snapping. He looked at the manager with an icy glare. "If she stays, I leave and I take my business, and the business of everyone I know with me. Choice is yours. Do you want a loyal client, or do you want to keep this charity case?" The manager looked at Nyla with a flicker of apology in his eyes, pressured by Marcus's perceived status. "Ma'am, perhaps it would be best if you—" He didn't finish the sentence. The heavy glass doors of the boutique suddenly hissed open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The manager's words died in his throat as his gaze shifted toward the entrance, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. Marcus, still focused on his petty victory, didn't see the shadow falling over him. He was too busy reveling in the fact that he was finally about to see Nyla dragged through the dirt again, unaware that the true authority had just arrived. Marcus saw the manager's hesitation as a sign of weakness, and his rage, fueled by years of unchecked arrogance, finally boiled over. "Since nobody here has the guts to do their job, I'll do it myself," he spat, his face contorted into a mask of pure aggression. He reached out and clamped a hand around Nyla's forearm, his fingers digging into her skin with a strength meant to remind her of the nights she spent shivering on the curb. He began to pull, dragging her toward the heavy glass doors with a violent jerk that nearly threw her off balance. "You're leaving, Nyla," Marcus hissed, his voice a low, jagged edge of malice. You don't get to stand here and act like you're better than me. You're going back to the gutter where you belong." He thought she would scream. He expected her to beg for him to stop just like she had 3 years ago. But Nyla didn't scream. She didn't struggle. Instead, she planted her heels into the plush carpet, her body becoming a solid, unyielding weight. "Let go of me, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register that should have warned him. "You have no idea what I'm capable of now." Marcus only laughed, a frantic, desperate sound as he pulled harder, blinded by his own delusion of control. He was so consumed by the need to humiliate her that he didn't notice the sudden silence that had fallen over the boutique. He didn't see the shoppers backing away with looks of pure terror, nor did he hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of polished boots against the marble floor. He was still dragging her, still convinced she was the girl with the trash bags, until a shadow fell over him that was so cold it felt like ice. The store's atmosphere shifted instantly, the air thickening with a predatory presence that made Marcus's grip suddenly feel small and pathetic. He felt a hand, as firm as iron and twice as cold, wrap around his wrist. "I believe the lady told you to let go," a deep voice rumbled, the perfect English carrying a slight, lethal Korean accent. Marcus froze, his heart hammering against his ribs as he slowly turned his head. He found himself looking up at a man who filled out a tailored black suit with a kind of muscular frame that spoke of violent discipline. Behind the man, 3 more figures in black suits moved in perfect, terrifying formation, locking the doors and cutting off any hope of escape. Marcus looked into the steel-gray eyes of Kim Tae-hyuk and realized, with a sickening jolt, that he wasn't looking at a businessman. He was looking at a predator who had just found someone touching his most prized acquisition. The store's own security guards, men who had been ready to follow Marcus's orders just moments ago, were shoved aside with a brutal, silent efficiency that left them gasping. They didn't even have time to reach for their radios before a wall of black-suited muscle replaced them. Co Jin-kyu led the formation, his face a mask of lethal professionalism as he and the other enforcers, Sung-jun and Dae-shik, moved with a synchronized purpose that signaled they weren't just bodyguards but hunters. They fanned out, their presence turning the boutique's luxury into a cold, tactical kill zone. Marcus's grip on Nyla's arm went slack, his fingers trembling as he realized he was suddenly surrounded by a squad of men who looked like they could dismantle the entire building with their bare hands. Jin-kyu stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus's terrified face, his stance disciplined and alert. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The way he stood, inches from Marcus's personal space, radiated a dangerous loyalty that promised a violent end to anyone who dared to breathe the wrong way. Nyla didn't move. She stood at the center of the iron circle they had created, her chin lifted, her natural curls catching the light of the chandeliers as she watched the color drain from Marcus's face. The store manager, seeing the coordination and the sheer power of the men who now controlled his entrance, backed away until he hit the counter, his hands raised in a silent plea for mercy. The shoppers who had been whispering moments ago were now paralyzed, trapped behind a wall of steel that had turned an afternoon of shopping into a display of absolute dominance. Jin-kyu reached out, his gloved hand moving with a slow, agonizing deliberation to brush Marcus's hand away from Nyla's sleeve, as if Marcus were nothing more than a piece of filth that had dared to touch a diamond. The message was clear. The woman Marcus had tried to drag out of the store like trash was now under the protection of a force that moved with a terrifying level of purpose. The gutter girl was gone, and in her place stood a woman guarded by kings who were waiting for a single nod to end Marcus's world. The wall of steel parted with surgical precision, and Kim Tae-hyuk stepped through. The temperature in the store didn't just drop, it died. He moved with a heavy, predatory grace, his tailored black suit absorbing the light of the overhead chandeliers. Every eye in the boutique was fixed on him, but Tae-hyuk's gaze was a singular, lethal laser focused entirely on the man trembling in front of Nyla. Marcus looked like a ghost, his bravado having evaporated into a cold sweat. He stood frozen, his hand still hovering in the air where he had just been gripping Nyla's arm. Tae-hyuk stopped inches away, his presence so overwhelming that Marcus actually stumbled back a step. The mafia boss didn't look at the expensive clothes or the cowering manager. His eyes dropped to Nyla's forearm, where the faint, reddening marks of Marcus's fingers were beginning to bloom against her skin. A terrifying silence stretched through the room, broken only by the sound of Marcus's ragged breathing. Taehyuk's expression didn't explode into rage. Instead, it hardened into something far more dangerous. A cold, calculated stillness. It was the look of a man deciding exactly how much a person's life was worth once they had touched something that belonged to him. "You have a very firm grip," Taehyuk said. His voice a low, melodic rumble that sent a shiver of pure ice down Marcus's spine. He spoke the English words perfectly, but the underlying threat was universal. "I wonder, do you use that same strength when you are begging for your life?" He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and adjusted the lapel of Marcus's suit jacket. The gesture was deceptively gentle, yet Marcus looked as though a gun were pressed against his forehead. Taehyuk's eyes finally flicked up to meet his, and for the first time in his life, Marcus understood what true power looked like. It wasn't loud, and it didn't need to shout. It was the man who owned the air you were breathing. "She told you to let go," Taehyuk whispered, leaning in just enough so that only Marcus could hear the jagged edge in his voice. "In my world we don't give second warnings. You looked at her and saw a girl you could break. I look at her and see the only reason you are still standing on two legs." Taehyuk turned his head slightly toward Nyla, his features softening by a fraction of a degree, not out of kindness but out of a dark, fierce possession. He reached out and draped a hand possessively over her shoulder, his touch a silent vow of protection that made the entire room realize the hierarchy had been permanently rewritten. The shadow of the king had fallen, and Marcus was trapped in the dark. Taehyuk's hand remained heavy on Nyla's shoulder, a claim of ownership that felt like a warm shield against the cold rot of Marcus's presence. He stepped even closer to the trembling man, the space between them disappearing until Marcus had to crane his neck back just to meet the mafia boss's icy gaze. The elite bodyguards stood like statues of obsidian, their silence more deafening than any shout. The store manager had stopped breathing entirely, sensing that he was witnessing a moment that usually happened in the blood-stained backrooms of Seoul's underworld, not under the crystal chandeliers of a boutique. "You spent a lot of time talking about what she was," Taehyuk murmured, his voice as smooth as high-end whiskey and just as flammable. He leaned down, his lips inches from Marcus's ear. Nyla watched as her ex-boyfriend's eyes went wide, the pupils shrinking into pinpricks of pure terror. Taehyuk whispered a single devastating sentence, the one sentence that stripped Marcus of his delusion of superiority. He told him exactly whose bed Nyla slept in, whose name was etched into the deed of the very building they stood in, and precisely what his men did to trash that tried to clutter his woman's path. "In my world," Taehyuk's whisper grew a fraction louder, vibrating with a lethal promise. "Men like you don't get to walk away with the hands they used to bruise my property." The color left Marcus's face so fast it was as if his blood had simply turned to water. He looked at Nyla, but he didn't see the gutter girl or the charity case anymore. He saw a queen draped in the shadow of a monster. He realized that every insult he had hurled, every time he had mocked her natural hair or her humble beginnings, he had been digging a grave that was now yawning open at his feet. Taehyuk pulled back, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips as he saw Marcus's knees begin to buckle. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been incinerated. Nyla felt a strange, soaring sense of peace. The man who had once shattered her world with a slammed door was now being undone by a single breath from the man who had rebuilt it. "Now," Taehyuk said, turning his attention to the cowering manager without taking his eyes off Marcus. "I believe there was a gown my lady was interested in. Pack it, along with everything else she touched, and ensure this person is escorted to the curb, just like the trash he claims to know so well." The manager didn't just nod. He bowed so low his forehead nearly hit the counter. Marcus looked like he wanted to beg, but his throat had constricted with fear, leaving him silent as the bodyguard stepped forward to fulfill the boss's command. The realization didn't hit Marcus like a slap. It hit him like a slow-moving freight train. As the bodyguards moved in, their formations tight and their eyes devoid of any human empathy, Marcus looked past Taehyuk toward the street. Through the expansive glass storefront, He saw the perimeter. It wasn't just one SUV. A fleet of black vehicles had completely neutralized the block, and men in similar suits were turning away local police with a single flash of a gold-embossed card. You're him, Marcus stammered, his voice reaching a pathetic, high-pitched frequency. He had heard the whispers in the high-stakes lounges of the city about the Iron Dragon, a man whose influence started in the ports of Incheon, bled through the financial districts of London, and ended in the private villas of Johannesburg. The Kim Syndicate. I thought you were a myth. Taehyuk didn't bother to confirm his identity. A king doesn't need to introduce himself to a peasant. Instead, he watched with a bored, clinical interest as Marcus's knees finally gave way. The man who had once stood over Nyla on a rainy curb was now a heap of trembling fabric on a marble floor. Marcus looked at Nyla, his eyes darting to her designer heels, realizing that the woman he had called a charity case was now the high priestess of an empire that spanned 3 countries. Nyla, please, Marcus gasped, his pride finally dissolving into the bitter bile of survival. We have history. I didn't know. I was joking. Nyla looked down at him, her expression one of profound disappointment rather than anger. That's the difference between us, Marcus. When I had nothing, I still had my dignity. You have everything, and you're still a coward. The table hadn't just turned. It had been flipped and shattered. The power Marcus thought he held, his mid-tier corporate job, his leased luxury car, his ability to bully those he deemed lesser, was a grain of sand compared to the mountain Nyla now stood upon. She wasn't just wealthy. She was protected by a man who could erase Marcus's entire existence with a flick of his wrist. Taehyuk signaled to Han Dae-shik, the largest of the enforcers. He's boring me. Take him to the alley. Explain to him that my woman's name is never to cross his lips again. Not in a joke, not in a memory, not even in a prayer. As Dae-shik grabbed Marcus by the collar and began to drag him toward the rear exit, the sound of Marcus's frantic begging echoed through the silent boutique. Nyla didn't flinch. She simply turned her back on her past, her eyes meeting Taehyuk's with a silent, mutual understanding. The girl who was sold for rent was gone. The woman who belonged to the boss was just getting started. The screams of Marcus fading into the back of the store were quickly drowned out by the silent, heavy respect of the room. Nyla didn't look back. She didn't need to. The woman who had once stood in the rain with trash bags had finally shed that skin, leaving it on the floor along with her ex-boyfriend's dignity. The store manager stood frozen, holding the wrapped gown like a holy relic. His head bowed so low he was nearly doubled over as Taehyuk's lead enforcer, Jin Kyu, took the package with a curt, terrifying nod. Taehyuk turned to Nyla, his cold features softening just enough to let her see the fire burning beneath his disciplined exterior. He didn't ask if she was okay, he knew she was. He simply offered his arm, his dark eyes searching hers for a moment of hesitation that he didn't find. Nyla placed her hand on his sleeve, the fine wool of his suit a stark contrast to the memory of the cheap polyester Marcus had used to drag her. As they walked toward the entrance, the wall of steel parted once more. The elite bodyguards fell into formation behind them, their boots echoing in a rhythmic, militaristic heartbeat against the marble. Nyla caught her reflection in the towering gold-rimmed mirrors of the boutique. She saw a woman with natural voluminous curls framing a face of unshakable confidence, a striking presence that commanded the air around her. She wasn't just a guest in this world. She was its new center of gravity. Stepping out into the sunlight, the fleet of black SUVs stood waiting, their engines humming like resting predators. The crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk parted in a wave of hushed awe and fear. Nyla felt the weight of the city not as a burden, but as a playground. Marcus had been right about one thing. She was never meant for his world. But he was too small to realize it was because she had been destined for a throne. Taehyuk handed her into the back of the lead vehicle, his hand lingering on hers. "The gala is waiting, Nyla," he murmured, his voice a low promise of the power yet to come. "And the world is waiting to see who you really are." As the door clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the common streets, Nyla looked out the tinted window. She realized then that she was never poor. She had simply been in transition, surviving the winter of her life until her king arrived to help her burn the past to the ground. The car pulled away, leaving the store and Marcus behind forever, as the new Queen of Seoul began her reign. This concludes our story, besties. Nyla finally got the justice she deserved.